Hello, and welcome to Facebook Live with the Kansas City Star Editorial Board. My name is Derek Donovan, and I'm joined today with my co-host and colleague, Toriano Porter. And our guests are Daniel Claiborn and Dr. Saz Madison. They are the founding CEO and the current president of Forensic Psychology Associates here in Kansas City. Dan, let's start with you. Tell us what Forensic Psychology Associates is.
It's a company that I began in 1981 to service police and fire departments, mainly in selecting officer candidates and firefighter candidates, but also providing a lot of other support services for police in particular. And we started with one department, the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, and grew over the years until we have served over 60 different regional departments and agencies in Missouri and Kansas, some statewide, some very small. We primarily help the departments identify good potential police officer candidates. Sometimes we meet with police officers after they've been involved in a critical incident. We have taught at various regional police academies for over 25 years now. So we provide a lot of other services for the departments too. And in addition to that, and Dr. Madison can talk more about this, we're always developing better techniques for identifying good potential police officers. And in particular, Dr. Madison lately has been focusing on research on measuring racial bias, which is something we're being much more sensitive to in the last few years.
And Daniel, doing this work over the last couple of decades, what makes a great police officer, or what makes a great candidate for a police officer?
Well, we look at about 10 or 11 or 12 different dimensions. It turns out that there are lots of different ways of being a good police officer. We look at emotional stability and conscientiousness and intelligence and all sorts of factors. In our reports, we make a recommendation to the department, but then we also point out every candidate's strengths and weaknesses so that the department can continue to work on the weaknesses in the training. So, but there isn't just one type of good police officer. Some people have military experience, some people don't. Some people have college educations and some don't. A few years ago, we did a study matching excellent police officers with a group of people who washed out, either were fired or quit voluntarily within the first couple of years. And we identified a few factors there, but it wasn't a big enough study to really be scientifically valid. One thing we looked at was whether they'd had military experience before, and we found that that didn't really predict being a good police officer. Intelligence has generally been a predictive factor, but there are many routes into it. More importantly, in our interviewing and our extensive testing, we're really looking for people who are not a good match, and then leaving it to the departments to look through the other strengths to decide who is a good fit for them. But we definitely try to alert the departments if we feel somebody is not emotionally stable or has anger control problems or racial bias or judgment issues.
So let's bring Saz in here. So we hear a lot these days about bad apples. That's a term you often brought up. What are some of those, Dan mentioned a couple there, but what are some of the things that you look for first and foremost when you want to put somebody in the maybe not pile?
Actually, there are a number of variables that we consider when we are looking for candidates who are suitable for law enforcement versus those who are unsuitable for law enforcement. That's the way that we think about it. Often you'll hear people say, will I pass or will I fail? When in reality, we're looking for suitability. And there's a number of variables that are associated with that, not the least of which are those that Dan mentioned before. But in addition to those cultural competence variables that we've recognized over the last several months have become more and more salient, more and more sort of in the forefront of our consciousness. So we pay close attention to cognitive factors, to cultural factors, and to behavioral factors to determine if there are any variables that would suggest this individual would not likely be a benefit to the community and to the agency.
Dr. Madison, how did you guys make that pivot to doing cultural competency work? Where did that come from?
That's a really
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good question, Toriano. Partially, for me, it's always been a question. Anytime an individual is going to be interacting with a community as rich and varied and full of diversity as a community in a city, for example, I recognize this potential impact of cultural factors. Having taught in this realm for the last decade or so, it was always in the forefront of my mind. So when thinking about what are some factors that are going to impact the likely success of these candidates, it was certainly something that was important. Dan mentioned earlier that I've been doing research related to this particular question. Over the last 4 years, I've been collecting pilot data on a measure of multicultural competence that's designed to be scientifically strong and reliable.
Okay, and Derek, if I could just follow up one quick question with that.
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Madison, what is your thoughts on residency requirements for police officers, not only in Kansas City, but St. Louis and throughout the country? Should police officers live in the community that they serve?
Of course, my rote response to that is the likelihood that interactions will be better increases drastically when the officers live in the communities that they serve. In fact, one of the points that we make when we're doing training, or even when we're just doing the interviews, is that if we do things that increase the likelihood that we will remember that we are members of the citizenry that we serve, we will be well informed, better informed when engaging with that community. So my thoughts on that certainly are that the research supports the idea that if I live and engage in the community that I am policing, the likely outcomes will be more positive.
You may have seen that we have been running a series of op-eds from African Americans in the Kansas City community about a variety of topics. And we had a very good one from Linwood Tawhid, who is a professor at UMKC. It ran on Sunday in the paper, where he said community policing, which is what we're talking about here, officers who are parts of the community that they are patrolling, is not enough, that we actually need to have people who are living in that community who are part of the policing force. Curious about your thoughts about it. And then I also had a letter to the editor, I think it's in today's paper, from a retired military member who said that, no, that's a problem because you've got an imbalance of power when people know the people that they are in charge of enforcing laws with. And sometimes you're going to have positive interactions that are going to influence it, but sometimes it's negative. So I'm curious about both of your thoughts on the whole idea of how close to the community can an officer be.
If it's okay, Dan, I'll answer first.
Sure.
The point that you made at the end of your question is actually an operative point. We want to be careful not to sort of separate this into either one side or another. Either it's going to be good or it is going to be poor. There are a number of variables that go into the likely success. This is why collecting as much data as possible on outcomes is becoming more and more important as we move forward. One of the things that we at FEA have been focusing on is collecting more information, gathering more data, and analyzing it in a way that we can answer with confidence these questions about outcomes. This question that you're asking right now regarding the efficacy of police officers living in their own communities, in the communities that they police, is a question that in order to answer with confidence, we would require access to data that allow us to analyze it and make definitive statements about those outcomes. So we can answer just sort of on its face, oh, sure, if they are there, they're more likely to be able to engage more appropriately. And someone else may come along and go, well, but then how do they have that sense of authority and command presence if they've been developing these personal relationships. In order to answer those questions in definitive ways, it's vital that we have access to data so that we can analyze them.
Could I add something to that too?
Please do.
I do think I lean toward the value of people coming from a community, living in the community that they're serving, but also from many aspects of that same community. So I think what really strengthens the police department in general is diversity. So people come from different neighborhoods in the community, different ethnic groups, different genders. So it's not just the community itself geographically, but it's some kind of a representative sample of the community as a whole. And by the way, I really like that essay from Linwood, and I actually emailed him and wanted to set up a dialogue to see if we could talk further. I haven't heard back from him yet.
Hey, Daniel, how do you guys balance, working with the police department, but also champion police reform, Black Lives Matter protests? Or do you guys even get involved in anything like that?
Well, and for my position, since I've actually turned the ownership and the running of the company over to Saz a few years ago, it's really left me a little more independence. And I've actually, the last few months, really been studying this and writing some essays and developing ideas about ways to enhance and reform and perhaps even deconstruct police departments. And I'm not speaking for our company at this point, but more just my perspective of having worked with police for so long. So actually being a little independent has let me have a little more freedom to make comments, but it's all based on my experience with these various departments that we've worked with for almost 40 years now, and watching what works as strengths and where they get hung up sometimes or underperform. So it's having watched that all this time.
Okay.
And one thing that I've heard often, did you say, Saz, you want to add to that?
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay.
I just wanted to add something to Toriano's question, which is a very, very good question. In advocating for the agencies, the 60 or so agencies that we provide services for, we remind ourselves that the agencies are made up of the members, and the members are made up of members of the community. So when I'm thinking about this question of how do I advocate for the agencies while advocating for the members and while advocating for those in the community who are struggling and facing a challenge, like you said, associated with Black Lives Matter, if I am integrating all of those, then I am advocating for the community, but also advocating for my agencies. As these outcomes become more and more effective, then that's advocating not only for the agency, but also for the communities that those agencies serve. So I think it's time for us to recognize that it's an integration of this work that's going to result in better outcomes overall.
And I would like to add just one thing to that. As I make comments to my friends in law enforcement and my essays and so on about possible improvements to law enforcement, it isn't really a punitive thing. I think this is what Saz is saying too. Some of the reforms and ways we might restructure law enforcement, I think would actually help the officers and the people out there risking their lives, doing what they need to do. So it's not opposing what they're doing. It's really trying to help them be more comfortable, be safer, be more effective at what they're doing.
And Daniel, by the way, contributed a guest essay to the Star recently, and I will put that in the first comment here on the Facebook post when we're done with the show so you can read it. One of the things that people on both sides of this debate often bring up is that we have to figure out a way to make it not an us versus them, with the police versus the communities that they police. In what way can your organization address that? And is that something that needs to be done on both sides?
It's certainly something that needs to be done on both sides. Members of the community, and this is a very important point, members of the community not only don't really have a full understanding of the type of training that a police officer goes through, but it's unrealistic to anticipate that members of the community would have a full understanding of that level of training or that type of training. What that does is it puts the onus more on the police department and the other agencies to do everything that they can to engage with the community and share information. And the more engaged with the community the agencies are, the more opportunities they have to share that type of information so that the community can gain a greater understanding of not just policy, but the way that agencies go about carrying out policing.
And another thing I would add to that would be just the sensitizing of police officers during their academy training and afterwards, as well as community members, about the two different cultures. I call it living while black and living while blue. If you're not a member of either of those cultures, you really can only have an intellectual understanding of maybe what it's like, but you don't have a real understanding. And I think there has to be a lot more listening from one culture to the other, and from people outside those cultures to people inside those cultures, to really, in a deeper way, solve this problem that we're facing.
That was a really good point, Daniel. Thank you for that. I mean, that was an excellent point, because, you know, I can't speak for a blue life, right? But I can't speak for a black life. And I know what I've been through, and I can relate to what some of the people who look like me been through. But I don't think people understand that. So I really appreciate you for touching on that. And Dr. Madison, for you touched on this earlier, but I wanted to circle back. What are some of the red flags that makes a potential bad officer?
So there are some variables that we look at that if they spike up in the testing, then we know it's going to be a concern. Most of those are associated with interpersonal function and with emotional and stress tolerance. So for example, if we see a certain constellation of resistance to authority, anger management concerns, anxiety, and hostility, we see a constellation like that, then we have major concerns at that point. Sometimes we can see, because within, you notice Dan mentioned earlier that there are about 13 different areas of function that we assess. Within each of those areas of function, there's anywhere from 5 to 12 different variables. So overall, we assess somewhere in the neighborhood of 79 variables, and all of those can show up in sort of different constellations, right? And so there are certain combinations of variables that together, it's not likely to be sort of controlled for by experience or more training or maturation. We say instead, this person at this time is not suitable for law enforcement. Right. That goes back to that comment that I made before. It's not about passing or failing necessarily. It's about suitability. Perhaps this candidate would make an excellent physician at some point, but is not at this time suitable for law enforcement. And those variables have come out of research that's been done over the last several decades. And we're at a point now where we're recognizing it's great that we've done this research to identify these variables. We recognize, especially over the last several months, that now it's time to move forward and use contemporary approaches to science and data analysis to understand the relationships among these variables better.
Right. And how does race and gender play a factor in these assessments?
It's absolutely an important factor. In fact, I administer during every battery. Built in now is that measure of multicultural competence that I shared with you. I've been collecting data on, and we ask specific questions that are generated by that measure, and that includes cultural factors that are related to all of the protected categories. So that includes race, ethnicity, and nationality, and gender identity, and sexual orientation. That includes religion, socioeconomic status. It includes age and ableism. And we tap into all of those variables when we're assessing the cultural competence component of the evaluation.
This has been a very valuable conversation. I have learned more in the past 20 minutes than I had any idea I needed to know. So
A lot of information.
Again, would like to thank Daniel Claiborn and Saz Madison, founding CEO and president of Forensic Psychology Associates here in Kansas City, my co-host and colleague Toriano Porter, and you, the audience. Thank you very much for joining us here on Facebook Live.
Thank you.